Showtime! The Capital G Show starts right now.
What's up YouTube, Capital G here. Sorry that I haven't posted any videos in about a week. I was actually in Tennessee last week and I was taking care of some business and I was just unable to really shoot anything or to get any new videos uploaded. So, you know, now I'm back and today I am talking about the top 5 decks of the format, the Yu-Gi-Oh hierarchy, except this time I'm putting a twist on it. I think that if most of us came up with a top 5 list in the format right now, we'd probably come up with the same 4 decks, maybe not in the same exact order, and maybe the 5th deck might be up in the air. So I figure let's talk about the top 5 anti-meta decks of the format. I kind of hate, you know, playing the meta decks like Dragon Rulers, Prophecy, and Mermail. So I figure this is my opportunity to give some of the anti-meta and lower tier decks some shine, and you guys might enjoy it just a little bit more, at least until, you know, we have a YCS and the order of the top 5 decks is established. So 5th deck I'm talking about is Rabbit Fist, and this can kind of be any combination of Macro Rabbit, Dino Rabbit, Fire Fist, and anything that runs those cards. For the most part, the decks pretty much operate very similarly. The decks are very linear, and right now, I mean, they still have, you know, really solid matchups against some of the lower tier decks. You still have games where you're going to open, you know, Lagia set 5 or Tenki plus Bear plus a lot of protection and your opponent can't do anything. And they even have some good matchups against some of the higher tier decks. I mean, Macro Rabbit can still stomp Mermail into the ground. You know, Fire Fist still have a pretty good matchup against EVILSWARM because, you know, the infestation pandemic virus doesn't stop Bear at all. And once you get OPHION on board, it's pretty much like open season on that deck. But having you know, having good matchups across the board when it comes to the higher tiers is just something that's out of the realm of possibility, and that's why these decks have pretty much just fallen off the end of the earth. They're pretty slow, their power plays are kind of limited, and they can't create a whole lot of offense. You know, outside of just one monster or a Rescue Rabbit play, that's pretty much all you're gonna get. Neither one of these decks have good matchups against Dragon Rulers, neither deck can handle Prophecy, and that's kind of why they're at the bottom of the list. But against some of the lower tier decks, they can still hold up strong. 4th deck I'm talking about is Chain Beat. I actually like Chain Beat a lot. First off, it completely dodges pretty much any monster removal that you can think of. Between the combination of Wind Up Rabbit and EVILSWARM Thunderbird, I mean, your opponent can throw Evacs and Fiendish Chains and Dark Holes and whatever they want at you, and for the most part these guys are just going to be getting around them every single turn. This deck can effectively use basically any good defensive measure or card that you can practically think of. I mean, anything, you know, Torrential Tributes, Bottomlesses, Fiendish Chain, you have room for everything because your monster lineup is relatively low, and cards like, you know, Compulse, Evac Device, and Torrential Tribute that would probably hurt another deck, I mean, your guys are just going to dodge those, so you don't have to worry about getting caught up in those when your opponent tries to make the Draco Sack play. You can just, you know, Compulse, escape them back to the deck, or you can just Torrential them and know that your Rabbit or Thunderbird's going to live. I think that Chain Beat's grind game is absolutely fantastic. It's probably the second biggest reason to run this deck and the second biggest benefit of the deck. I say that because, I mean, for the most part, you can just keep 5 in your back row for the entire game, knowing that if you have to grind a game out, your back row should be getting rid of your opponent's monsters, but your Wind Up Rabbit and Thunderbird should be eating up your opponent's back row, and they should just be dancing around those cards. This deck can often struggle against the Elemental Dragons themselves. I say that because those cards have an inherent resistance to cards like D-Prison and Bottomless Trap Hole, so, you know, if you're using those against the E-Dragons, you're going to be losing advantage and probably losing the game soon after. It's actually quite odd that Draco Sack is much easier to deal with in this deck than the E-Dragons that make Draco Sack. I think that this deck's Exceed plays are extremely limited. It's very difficult to consistently pull off rank 4s in this deck, and I mean, they're awkwardly made at best, and probably the biggest detriment to Chain Beat is it has absolutely no answer to Prophecy, and that's probably the biggest reason why people aren't playing the deck right now. Number 3, I've got template gadgets, and out of all of these anti-meta decks, this deck probably gets the most consistent opening hands. I like its ability to keep and maintain hand advantage, and it actually has a pretty strong resistance against back row, considering gadgets pay for themselves the second that you summon them, and even your go-to XC card being Gear Giant X, I mean that pays for itself the second it hits the field too, so it's basically a floater also. This deck also has one really strong ability that none of these other decks have, and that's the ability to go derp just like the higher tier decks in this format. And I'm talking about making rank 7 XCs. This can be done with MACHINA Fortress, it can be done with Tragodia, so you know you can make those big eye plays and steal your opponent's monsters. You can drop the uber broken Draco Sack and just absolutely destroy a lot of the lower tier decks with just that one card. Now this deck does struggle against a lot of the top tier decks, as you know the turn 1 Shockmaster play, it's not really accessible in this deck, and you know rank 4 plays don't really do anything against Dragon Rulers, they don't really do much against Prophecy. Also, Ophion can be a serious hindrance to this deck, as Ophion stops MACHINA Fortress, Ophion stops Tragodia, so some of the higher tier decks can absolutely destroy this deck, but it does have some power in its arsenal. My number 2 deck is Thunder Family, and I'm probably a little higher on this deck than most people, but I am just so enamored by the fact that Thunder Family has one of the most optimal extra deck lineups in the entire game of Yu-Gi-Oh! I mean, how many decks do you know can drop turn 1 Shockmaster and then in the next game drop turn 1 Crimson Blair? Like, that's mind-blowing. And unlike many decks that have access solely to Xyz or solely to Synchros, this deck can do both of them with the best of them. Maybe it can't Synchro at the speed of a deck like Dragoonity or Infernity, but when this deck does Synchro, you get a huge boost that is exclusive to this deck. I mean, having a 3800 Crimson Blader or a 3800 Stardust is nothing to sneeze at. You know, the turn 1 Shockmaster is accessible for problem matchups like Dragon Ruler and Prophecy, and the ability to run Honest is just something that, you know, I think elevates this deck. Now, I will say this, while I do like a lot of the elements of the Thunder Family, unless you get your power plays running early, I'm talking about like Crimson Blader against Dragons or the turn 1 Shockmaster against Prophecy, you're going to get steamrolled in this format. I say that because non-theme rank 4 Xyz are just not cutting it right now outside of Abyss Dweller when playing against Mermills. I mean, if your opponent activates Spellbook of Judgment or puts a Draco Sack on field and you don't have an answer immediately, you might as well just scoop it up, because this deck isn't coming back. All your monsters are relatively weak. I'm talking 1600 and under, and this deck really isn't that explosive, so once you lose control, the game is over. And that leads us to the number 1 deck. Now, some people might want to debate the legitimacy of this deck as an anti-meta deck, but I mean, come on guys, let's be real. Look at the playstyle of the deck. It operates almost identically to most anti-meta decks. Your entire win condition is made through lockdown and protect the boss monster, so I think that it counts. The deck that I'm talking about is EVILSWARM, and flat out, EVILSWARM's just the most consistent anti-meta deck in the format. I think that this deck reminds me a lot of Dino Rabbit back when it had 3 rabbits and 3 tour guides, and when you can just shut down 2 extremely high tier decks like Mermill and Dragon Ruler with 1 boss monster, you're gonna be one of the higher tier decks yourself. This deck has a really high resistance to all spell and trap monster removal cards, thanks to this one card called Pandemic Infestation Virus. Not only does it work on all of your monsters outside of, like, you know, Rescue Rabbit, but it also is freaking searchable through that boss monster that shits on literally half a dozen decks. You can also easily main cards like Eradicator Virus so that you can deal with problem matchups like Prophecy and Chainburn without losing an ounce of consistency. And as I said, I mean, literally a half a dozen lower tier decks are just completely unplayable because of one card that you run that you can drop consistently turn 1. Decks like Chaos Dragons, Happy Herald, Gem Knights, Karakuri. If you run into these decks, I mean, you basically auto win against them, and you can side relatively easy against almost any high tier deck in the format, but they actually struggle siding against you. I mean, against Prophecy, you can side in things like Eradicator Virus or other cards that, you know, Thunder King Ryo. Against Dragons, which is already a relatively easy matchup, you can just side in things like Kaiku, or, you know, against Water, you can side in Macrocosmos or D-Fissure. But, you know, those decks actually have a hard time answering you. So, you know, I think that EVILSWARM is basically what decks like Dino Rabbit used to be. I mean, you have your one boss monster that just shuts down entire decks. You have a Forbidden Lance that blankets the entire field, that's searchable, that, you know, basically acts as the Forbidden Lance in the old Dino Rabbit. And I mean, that's where I think that this deck is gonna be. I think that it's gonna be one of the higher tier decks that is probably gonna be very good until the end of the format. So let me know what you guys think. Maybe I missed one of the decks that you wanted me to talk about. Thank you for watching and take care. Subscribing makes life happy.